My name is Renata Castellano. I'm 35 years old, and 6 weeks ago, at my cousin's baby shower, my sister Whitney told our extended family, in front of nearly 30 people, that I just froze and did nothing the day our father collapsed in his backyard, and that she was the one who actually kept him alive until the paramedics got there. She didn't know that the county's 911 dispatch center had already sent me a certified copy of the call log and the recorded audio 3 weeks earlier at my own request, and that my voice was on that recording from the first second to the last. I didn't argue with her at the shower. I just smiled, said I was glad Dad was doing well, and finished my slice of cake. I already had what I needed sitting in a folder on my closet shelf at home. To understand why I wasn't shaking when she said that, you need to go back to a Saturday afternoon in May, the day our father, Sal Castellano, collapsed face down in the grass next to his tomato plants, 4 minutes before I dialed 911, and 41 seconds before anyone else in that backyard fully understood what was happening. Before I get into it, if you're new here, take a second to subscribe to The Quiet Reckoning. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Drop the word witness in the comments if you've ever had to prove something true that somebody else tried to rewrite right in front of you. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to that Saturday, because you need the full picture before any of what happened at that baby shower makes sense. My father is 71, retired from 32 years with the county water department, and lives alone in the same house in Bakersfield, California, that he and my mother bought in 1988, 2 years before she passed. I live 12 minutes away and see him most weekends. Whitney, my older sister by 3 years, lives across town with her husband and 2 kids and sees him less often, usually holidays and the occasional Sunday dinner, though she's always described herself to anyone who'll listen as the one who really takes care of Dad, largely because she handles his pharmacy pickups and drives him to his cardiology appointments, which I don't dispute mattered. I just want to be clear about the shape of things before I describe what happened that Saturday, because the shape matters. Growing up, Whitney and I split family responsibility along fairly predictable lines. She was always the organizer, the one who remembered birthdays, coordinated holidays, kept a running list of who owed whom a visit. I was the one who showed up quietly and did whatever needed doing without announcing it, whether that meant fixing Dad's garden hose or sitting with him through a long, boring afternoon of paperwork after Mom passed. Neither role felt more important than the other for most of our adult lives. It's only in hindsight, looking back at the last several years, that I've started to notice how much Whitney's version of taking care of Dad depended on being visibly, verbally credited for it, in a way mine never really did. I didn't mind that difference for a long time. I minded it a great deal after that Saturday in May. That particular Saturday was Dad's birthday, a small backyard barbecue, maybe 15 people. Whitney, her husband Marcus, their kids, a few of Dad's old co-workers, my Aunt Carol, and me. I'd gotten there around noon to help set up. Whitney arrived about an hour later with a store-bought cake and immediately got pulled into a long phone call with her son's soccer coach about a schedule conflict, standing near the side gate for most of the early afternoon, half present in the yard and half somewhere else entirely, which is, I think, an important detail for what comes later. At around 2:50 in the afternoon, Dad was standing near the grill, talking to his old co-worker Ray about a fishing trip, when he stopped mid-sentence, put a hand out toward the fence like he was trying to steady himself, and went down into the grass beside his tomato plants. Ray called out. I was maybe 15 feet away, refilling a cooler with ice, and I got to him within seconds. I want to describe what I actually did, because 6 weeks later, the accuracy of this part turned out to matter more than I could have imagined that afternoon. I checked for breathing and responsiveness. Nothing. No response to his name. No normal breathing. Just an occasional gasping sound I recognized. from a CPR refresher course my school district requires every 2 years for its staff, as agonal breathing, which isn't real breathing at all, just a reflexive gasp the body sometimes makes in cardiac arrest that can fool people into thinking someone's still breathing normally when they're not. I called out for someone to bring my phone from the patio table, and Ray's wife brought it to me. I dialed 911 at 2:51 p.m. The dispatcher, a woman whose voice I will never forget, even though I never learned her name that day, answered within seconds. She asked for the address, confirmed it, and then asked whether my father was breathing normally. I told her no, that he'd collapsed and wasn't responding. She told me calmly and clearly, "I'm going to help you start CPR right now. Is he on his back?" This is something I only fully understood the significance of after the fact. Most 911 dispatch centers use a nationally recognized protocol for exactly this situation, walking an untrained caller through compression-only CPR in real time, question by question, count by count, because the first few minutes after a cardiac arrest matter more than almost anything else that happens afterward. Emergency medical researchers call it telecommunicator CPR, sometimes dispatcher-assisted CPR, and the idea behind it is simple. Most people who witness a cardiac arrest have never been trained or panic and forget what they learned years ago. So the 911 dispatcher becomes the actual first responder, coaching a total stranger through compressions in real time until paramedics physically arrive. I didn't know the formal name for it that day. I just knew a stranger's voice was telling me exactly what to do, 1 second at a time, while my father lay in the grass in front of me. I rolled him onto his back with Ray's help. The dispatcher told me to interlace my fingers, place the heel of my hand on the center of his chest, and push hard and fast, about 2 inches deep, and to keep going without stopping until paramedics arrived or he started breathing on his own. She counted with me, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, on and on, her voice steady in a way mine was not. I remember Marcus, Whitney's husband, standing a few feet away, phone out, recording, not out of malice, I think, just out of the specific kind of shock that makes people do strange things with their hands. I remember my Aunt Carol crying near the fence. I remember Ray kneeling beside me, ready to switch in if my arms gave out. I do not remember at any point during those 7 minutes seeing Whitney anywhere near us. My arms were shaking by the 4th minute, the specific ache that comes from pushing on someone's chest continuously without stopping, harder than feels natural, hard enough that I remember worrying, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I might be hurting him. And the dispatcher, as if she'd heard the hesitation in my voice, said, "You're doing exactly what he needs right now. Don't stop." Ray switched in for about 90 seconds around the 5th minute when my arms genuinely gave out, and then I went back to it, because something in me needed to be the one doing it when the paramedics finally came through that gate. The paramedics arrived at 2:58 p.m., 7 minutes after my call connected, which I know precisely because it's recorded in the dispatch log, time-stamped the way every 911 call and every unit response is time-stamped by the county's computer-aided dispatch system. They took over compressions, used an AED that one of them had grabbed from the truck, and got a pulse back before they even loaded him into the ambulance. He was in the ICU for 4 days. He's alive today, walking, gardening again, mostly because of a chain of events that started with a dispatcher's voice counting compressions in my ear and ended with a defibrillator in my father's own backyard. I didn't think about any of this in terms of proof or documentation in the days afterward. I was just grateful, exhausted, and spending most of my time at the hospital, sleeping in the recliner in his room, tracking his oxygen levels on the monitor, like I could will them higher just by watching. The cardiologist who saw him that first night explained that Dad had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest caused by a blocked artery, and that the compressions performed before paramedics arrived were, in her words, very likely the single biggest factor in him having any meaningful chance at recovery at all, since brain and organ damage compounds by the minute once blood stops circulating. She sat with me for almost 20 minutes that first night, patiently answering every question I could think to ask, and I remember being grateful, in the middle of the worst night of my life, for someone willing to explain things clearly instead of rushing off to the next patient. She mentioned, almost in passing, a statistic that stuck with me afterward, that out of the hundreds of thousands of people who suffer cardiac arrest outside a hospital every year in this country, only a small fraction survive to leave the hospital, and that survival depends enormously on how quickly someone starts compressions and how quickly a defibrillator gets involved. I didn't fully process that number in the moment. I mostly just sat by his bed, watching the ventilator, waiting for him to open his eyes. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, at a smaller family dinner at Aunt Carol's house, that I first heard the version of that Saturday that Whitney had apparently been telling people. She was describing the day to Aunt Carol's neighbor, someone who hadn't been there, and I heard her say, plainly, I was the one doing compressions when the ambulance got there. Renata kind of froze up, honestly. It's a lot to handle if you're not used to that kind of thing. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, genuinely unsure I'd heard her correctly. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself, generously, that maybe grief and stress had scrambled her memory of a chaotic 7 minutes, the way trauma sometimes does to anyone's timeline. I've read that adrenaline can do strange things to memory, compress it, rearrange it, make people genuinely believe things that didn't happen the way they remember them. I wanted, badly, to believe that's all this was. What changed my mind was a conversation with Marcus, about a week later, completely unprompted. He mentioned, almost offhand, that he still had the video on his phone from that day. He'd started recording out of shock and forgotten to stop, and asked if I wanted a copy, since he thought I might want it someday, for Dad, to remember how close it had been. I asked to see it before he sent it. It showed exactly what I remembered. Me on my knees in the grass, the dispatcher's voice audible faintly through my phone's speaker on the ground beside me, counting compressions, Ray beside me ready to switch, and Whitney, visible at the edge of the frame for several seconds, standing near the side gate, phone still in her other hand, not moving toward us until the paramedics were already in the yard. I didn't want to build a case against my sister over a chaotic afternoon. I want to be honest about that. What I wanted, watching that video, was simply to understand why she'd tell a stranger the opposite of what had happened, in a kitchen, casually, like it cost her nothing to say. I decided, quietly, that I wanted something more official than a phone video, something that couldn't be dismissed as one angle or one person's memory. I looked up how to request the actual 911 call recording and the dispatch log for that afternoon, and found that in California, as in most states, these records are generally treated as public records under the California Public Records Act, obtainable through a written request to the responding dispatch agency, sometimes subject to a processing fee and a short review period, though certain sensitive material can occasionally be withheld or redacted depending on the circumstances. Since I was the actual caller and the incident hadn't required any law enforcement investigation, I didn't expect much resistance, and I didn't get any. I submitted a written request to the Kern County Sheriff's Office Communications Division, since they handle 911 dispatch for that part of Bakersfield, including the incident date, approximate time, and address. About 11 days later, I received a packet, a computer-aided dispatch summary showing my father's address, the call's start time of 2:51:04 p.m., the unit dispatch time, and the paramedics' arrival time-stamped at 2:58:12 p.m., along with an audio file of the full call. I sat in my car in a parking lot the first time I played it, listening to my own voice, 7 minutes long, saying, "Okay," and "I'm doing it," and "How many more?" over and over, while the dispatcher counted compressions in the background the entire time. I cried in that parking lot, longer than I expected to, hearing my own voice from a day I remembered mostly in fragments, now laid out second by second in a stranger's careful, professional cadence. I didn't confront Whitney with it immediately. I want to be honest about why. Part of me still hoped this was a strange, isolated exaggeration that wouldn't come up again, something I could simply let go of once Dad was fully recovered and everyone's nerves had settled. That hope lasted until my cousin's baby shower, 6 weeks after the collapse, when Whitney, mid-conversation with our great aunt about how scary that whole day was, said the sentence I opened this story with, that I'd frozen and done nothing, and that she was the one who'd kept our father alive until the paramedics arrived. I didn't raise my voice. I set my cake plate down, and I said calmly, "Whitney, I actually have the county's call log and the 911 recording from that day, if you want to go through it together sometime." The table went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when nobody's sure yet whether an accusation has just been made or a simple fact has just been stated. I don't need to see anything," she said, her voice a little higher than usual. "I know what happened. I was there." "I was there too," I said. "The recording just happens to have a timestamp on it. Dispatch logged the call starting at 2:51 and paramedics arriving at 2:58. My voice is on that recording the entire 7 minutes, doing exactly what the dispatcher told me to do. I'm not trying to make this a whole thing today. I just don't think it's fair to tell people I froze when there's an actual record showing otherwise." Our great-aunt looked between the two of us, clearly unsure what to do with any of this. Whitney's face did something complicated, not quite anger, not quite embarrassment, something closer to a person recalculating a story she'd told enough times that she'd maybe started to believe her own version of it. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said finally. "It was chaotic. Maybe I misremembered some of it." "That's fine," I said. "I just needed it to stop being the version people hear, because Dad's going to hear it eventually too, and I don't want him thanking the wrong person for the reason he's still here." Aunt Carol pulled me aside in the kitchen before I left, drying a dish she didn't need to be drying, and told me quietly that she'd actually seen the same thing I remembered, Whitney near the gate, not moving toward us, but that she hadn't wanted to say anything at the time because she didn't want to make a hard day harder for anyone. "I should have corrected her weeks ago, when she first started telling it that way," Carol admitted. "I think I just hoped it would fade out on its own, instead of me having to be the one who said something." I told her I understood completely, because I'd hoped the exact same thing myself for 3 straight weeks before deciding I couldn't anymore. I didn't stay much longer at the shower after that. I hugged our cousin, congratulated her, and left before things could get more uncomfortable than they already had. I didn't feel triumphant driving home. I felt mostly tired, the specific tiredness of having to prove something that should never have needed proving in the first place. 6 weeks have passed since that Saturday, and about 10 days since the baby shower. Whitney and I have spoken exactly twice since then, both short, careful conversations, neither of us quite back to normal yet. She sent a text a few days after the shower that said simply, "I shouldn't have said that. I think I was scared that day and it came out sideways somehow. I'm sorry." I appreciated her sending it, even if I'm still working out what to do with the apology. I told her I needed some time before things felt easy between us again, and she said she understood. My father knows the full story now. I showed him the CAD summary and played him a portion of the recording, not to turn him against Whitney, but because I thought he deserved to know exactly what happened in his own backyard while he was unconscious in the grass. He was quiet for a long moment after listening to it. Then he reached over and squeezed my hand and said, I always figured it was you talking to me in there, somewhere far away. I just didn't have proof until now." He hasn't said much to Whitney about it directly as far as I know, though he did mention gently that he wanted both of us to be honest with him and with each other going forward, because apparently the truth's got a paper trail now, whether we like it or not. I think about Whitney sometimes, and I don't feel real anger toward her, even after the shower. I think she's spent years quietly positioning herself as the daughter who handles things for Dad, the appointments, the prescriptions, the paperwork, and I think watching me be the one physically keeping him alive, in the one moment that mattered more than any of that, disrupted something in the story she'd built about her own role in this family. I don't think she set out to lie maliciously. I think it was easier, in the moment, to tell people the version where she was the hero, rather than sit with the harder truth that she'd frozen near a gate while someone else did the work. I've thought a lot these past few weeks about why Whitney needed that version of the story so badly in the first place. I don't think it was simple cruelty. I think it's something closer to a fear she's carried for years without naming it. The fear of not being essential, of being the daughter who handles logistics while someone else does the thing that actually determined whether our father lived. Whitney has always been excellent at the visible parts of caretaking, the appointments and the paperwork and the coordinated family calendar, and I think some part of her genuinely couldn't tolerate the idea that the single most important moment of Dad's entire medical history happened without her at the center of it. I understand that fear, even if I don't think it justified what she said. Ray, Dad's old co-worker, called me about 2 weeks after the shower, having heard some second-hand version of the tension through Aunt Carol. He said something I've held on to since. "I was right there, Renata. I know exactly what I saw. You don't need anyone's permission to know what actually happened that day, and you definitely don't need anyone's permission to prove it." I appreciated him saying that more than he probably realizes. Sometimes it takes an outside witness, someone with nothing personally at stake in the family narrative, to say plainly what should have been obvious from the beginning. I think about that afternoon often now, not with dread the way I expected to, but with a strange, quiet clarity. I think about the specific sound of the dispatcher's voice, steady and calm, counting compressions while my own voice cracked beside her. I think about how close 7 minutes actually is, and how far it can also feel, kneeling in wet grass beside your father's tomato plants, genuinely unsure whether he's going to open his eyes again. I think about Whitney standing near that gate, and I try, most days, to extend her the same grace I'd want extended to me, if fear had ever made me freeze in a moment that mattered. I just also think the truth deserves to exist clearly, time-stamped and unambiguous, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes the people who'd rather it stayed vague. I've also found myself thinking, more than I expected to, about the dispatcher whose name I never learned. She spent 7 minutes of her own shift entirely focused on a stranger's collapsed father in a backyard she'd never see, counting compressions in a voice that never once wavered, doing a job that mostly goes unnoticed, unless someone later requests the recording and actually listens to it start to finish. I think about how much of what kept my father alive that day depended on a whole invisible system functioning quietly and correctly all at once. A trained telecommunicator, a well-rehearsed protocol, a paramedic crew that made it in under 7 minutes, an AED charged and ready in the truck. None of that system cared, even slightly, about which sister was standing closer to the gate. It simply did its job, and it did that job because I picked up a phone and stayed on the line exactly as long as it took. If you're watching this and someone has ever rewritten your role in a moment that mattered, especially a moment where you showed up and they didn't, I want you to hear this. Because I spent 3 weeks hoping I'd never have to say any of this out loud, and I understand exactly why that hope is tempting. You don't need to raise your voice to correct the record. Sometimes the truth is already sitting in a government office somewhere, time-stamped, waiting quietly for the moment someone finally asks to see it. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't confronting someone loudly in a kitchen the night you first hear the lie. It's simply requesting the paperwork, quietly, and trusting that the truth, once it's documented, doesn't need you to defend it nearly as hard as you think it will. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about a time you had to prove something true that someone else tried to take credit for. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week here on The Quiet Reckoning. There's another one waiting for you, about a woman whose brother told the insurance company she'd never once visited their mother in the hospital. 312 documented visits later.